Imagine it's 2018. You're standing in Caracas, Venezuela. You're one of the smart ones. You saw it coming. Years before the currency collapsed, before the store shelves emptied, before the power grid started failing and rolling blackouts, you converted a portion of your savings into gold, coins, hidden, physical possession, the ultimate insurance. And now, as hyperinflation renders the believer worthless, as your neighbor's life savings evaporate into nothing, you're protected. Except you're not eating any better than they are. The pharmacy is empty. The supermarket has armed guards and nothing to guard. Your daughter needs antibiotics, and no one in the city has them. You know a man who operates on the black market. He might have what you need. You offer gold. He laughs. He says, "What am I going to do with that? I need gasoline. I need medicine. I need someone who can fix my generator. You have gold? I don't have a use for gold." You leave empty-handed. Across the country, there are communities that never experience the same desperation. They're not wealthier. They're not politically connected. They didn't buy gold. They grow food. They fix things. They know their neighbors. They have what you don't. The ability to produce, the ability to exchange without currency, and something rarer still, trust. Let that sink in. This is not a script against gold. Gold has its place. Gold has preserved wealth across centuries, across empires, across monetary collapses. Anyone who dismisses gold entirely doesn't understand monetary history. But this script is about a different question. One almost nobody in the financial preparedness space is willing to ask honestly, what happens when gold isn't enough? What happens when the system doesn't just inflate away but fractures? When the infrastructure that allows exchange itself breaks down? When the assumption that you can trade gold for goods stops being valid? Not because gold lost its value, but because the act of exchange lost its foundation? This isn't theory. It's documented history. There is a pattern. It's visible in every severe collapse. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Gold protects against currency failure. It does not protect against systemic failure. And there is a difference. The financial prepper community has spent decades telling a particular story. The story goes like this. The government prints money, the currency debases, paper wealth evaporates, but those who hold real money, gold, silver, retain purchasing power. They emerge from the chaos whole. They win. The story is not wrong. It's just incomplete. It assumes the existence of a functioning economy to emerge into. It assumes that exchange remains possible. It assumes that there are still goods to buy, that there are still sellers willing to sell, that there is still a price mechanism operating, even informally. In a hyperinflation, like Weimar Germany, like Zimbabwe, like Argentina in 2001, those assumptions usually hold. The economy strains, the currency fails, but the underlying system continues. Farmers still bring food to market. Merchants still accept payment, just not in the dying currency. Gold in these scenarios performs exactly as advertised. But hyperinflation is not the only form of collapse. There is another form, rarer, deeper, more dislocating. It's what happens when the system itself stops functioning. Not the currency, but the supply chains, the logistics, the infrastructure, the social trust, the institutional coordination. In those collapses, gold behaves very differently, and almost no one talks about it. Let's go back further. Let's examine what gold actually is, mechanically. Gold is not wealth. Gold is a claim on wealth. This is not semantics. It's essential. Wealth is food, shelter, medicine, energy, tools, skills, services, the capacity to produce these things. Gold is a token, a highly durable, universally recognized, historically trusted token that allows you to exchange for wealth across time and space. It stores value. It transfers value. But it does not create value. In a stable system, or even a destabilized but functional system, this distinction doesn't matter. You trade gold for what you need. The token works. But in a fractured system, the distinction is everything. Because tokens require counterparties. You cannot eat gold. You cannot heat your home with gold. You cannot cure an infection with gold. You cannot rebuild a machine with gold. Gold's value is entirely derivative of your ability to exchange it for things that do those jobs. An exchange requires infrastructure. It requires someone who has what you need. It requires that person to be reachable. It requires them to trust that your gold is genuine. It requires them to want gold in the first place, which itself requires them to believe that someone else, later, will also accept it. Take away any link in that chain and the token becomes inert. This is where the historical record starts telling a different story than the gold newsletters. Let's look at the Soviet collapse. In 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated. 15 republics fractured into independence. The ruble, already strained, became nearly worthless. Hyperinflation followed. Gold should have been the winning trade, and in some narrow sense it was. Those who held gold retained something when the currency died. But here's what the gold narrative misses. The real crisis wasn't monetary, it was logistical. The Soviet system, whatever its flaws, had one achievement: centralized distribution. Goods moved on state-directed supply chains. Factories produced, farms delivered, clinics received medicine. When the state collapsed, the distribution collapsed with it. Store shelves emptied, not because there was no food in the country, but because the mechanism that moved food to shelves no longer existed. Factories sat idle, not because workers were unwilling, but because no one knew who to invoice, who to pay, or how to source raw materials. Gold couldn't solve that. The people who survived best in the early post-Soviet period weren't gold holders. They were people with access to production, dacha owners who could grow food, rural families with chickens and potatoes, urban dwellers with networks, people who knew mechanics, doctors, farmers, black marketeers. The currency of survival wasn't gold. It was relationships, skills, and the ability to create or access real goods outside the failed distribution system. This is documented. This is not interpretation. The stories from that era are consistent. What mattered was who you knew and what you could do. Now let's examine an even more severe case: the siege of Leningrad. From 1941 to 1944, Nazi forces encircled the city. No food came in, no fuel, no medicine. Nearly 900 days of blockade. There were wealthy people in Leningrad. There were people with gold, jewelry, heirlooms. There were families who had accumulated real savings. It didn't save them. As the siege tightened, the economy shifted. First, gold could buy food at horrific exchange rates, but it worked. Black markets accepted it. Then, as food supplies disappeared entirely, the exchange stopped. Not because gold lost value, but because there was nothing to buy. What remained? Ration cards, connections to the distribution system, ability to work in a factory that received state rations, having a family member in the military or government, growing a tiny plot of vegetables in the city. The people who survived weren't the wealthiest. They were the most connected to the production and distribution of food. Gold couldn't create bread when there was no bread. Think about what that means. There's a mental model that's useful here. I call it the exchange assumption. The exchange assumption is the belief, usually unconscious, that you will always be able to exchange one form of value for another, that money can become goods, that gold can become food, that your stored wealth can convert, when needed, into survival. Modern life runs on this assumption. It's why we specialize, why we work jobs that produce nothing we can eat or use directly, why we trust that the salary in our bank account can be converted at any time into what we need. The exchange assumption is valid almost all of the time, until it isn't. In hyperinflation, the exchange assumption bends, but doesn't break. The currency fails, but exchange continues. Gold works because the underlying system, while strained, still functions. But in a true systemic collapse, supply chain failure, grid failure, institutional disintegration, the exchange assumption breaks entirely. And when it breaks, gold becomes a paperweight with historical prestige. Let me be precise about this. I am not saying gold is useless. I'm not saying don't hold gold. I'm not offering investment advice. I am saying that gold is a hedge against a specific type of failure, monetary failure within a functioning system. It is not a hedge against systemic failure. And the mistake most people make is assuming one type of collapse when the actual risk is the other. This brings us to the Amish. If you study American communities over the past century, one of the strangest anomalies is the Amish. They don't use modern technology. They reject grid electricity. They travel by horse. They farm with methods that predate the internal combustion engine. And yet, by most measures of stability, they outperform the mainstream economy. Amish communities have near zero rates of bankruptcy, near zero homelessness, near zero dependence on government assistance. During the Great Depression, while surrounding communities lost farms to foreclosure, most Amish communities stayed intact. During the 2008 financial crisis, they barely noticed. This is not because they're wealthier. By GDP measures, they're much poorer than average Americans. It's because they're structured differently. They have minimal debt. Their production is local. Their supply chains are internal. Their skills are diversified. Their social networks are thick and obligatory. When the external system fails, when the exchange assumption breaks for everyone else, they don't notice because they were never depending on it. This is the Amish Hedge. Let's define it precisely. The Amish Hedge is not a financial position. It's a structural position. It consists of several interlocking elements. First, local production capacity. The ability to produce essentials, food, shelter, basic medicine, tools, energy, within your own community without dependence on external supply chains. Second, diversified skills. A community where individuals can do multiple things, where one person can farm and another can build and another can heal and another can repair. Specialization is efficient in stable systems. Diversification is resilient in unstable systems. Third, low energy dependence. The Amish use minimal fossil fuels, minimal electricity. They're not exposed to grid failure. They're not exposed to oil shocks. Their production continues regardless of what happens in global energy markets. Fourth, thick social networks, relationships that carry obligation. The Amish practice mutual aid not as charity, but as structure. And when one family's barn burns, the community rebuilds it. This isn't sentiment, it's insurance. It's a distributed savings system that doesn't require currency. Fifth, minimal debt. Amish communities carry almost no debt. They're not leveraged. They're not exposed to interest rate changes or credit contractions. Their consumption is limited to what they can produce or afford in cash. Sixth, a closed-loop economy. Much of Amish exchange happens internally. They trade with each other. They favor Amish businesses. They keep wealth circulating within the network. This insulates them from external demand shocks. Put it together, and you get a community that is nearly immune to the kind of systemic collapse that gold is supposed to protect against, but actually can't. Now here's the uncomfortable part. You cannot buy the Amish Hedge. You can't order it online. You can't transfer it to a vault. You can't store it in a safe deposit box. It's not an asset, it's a structure. And structures take decades to build. This is the trap that most financial preppers fall into. They approach resilience as a purchasing problem. Buy gold, buy guns, buy freeze-dried food, buy land. All of those things have value. None of them are useless, but they don't address the core vulnerability. What happens when you have land but no one to work it? When you have tools but no skills to use them? When you have food but no way to secure it? When you have gold but no counterparties? The Amish didn't prepare for collapse. They built a way of life that doesn't require the external system to function. That's not preparation, that's structural independence. Let's return to the historical record to reinforce this. Argentina, 2001. The banking system froze. The peso collapsed. Overnight, middle-class families found their savings locked in banks that might never reopen. Gold holders fared better than those who held pesos. That's true. But who fared best? Rural families, farmers, people with land that could produce, communities with local economies, barter networks that emerged in urban neighborhoods. In Buenos Aires, neighborhood assemblies formed. People who had never spoken to their neighbors organized exchange systems, services for goods, goods for services, with no currency at all. The people who thrived weren't those with the most stored value. They were those who could produce value and were connected to networks of trust. Zimbabwe, 2008. The world's most famous hyperinflation. A loaf of bread cost 100 billion Zimbabwean dollars. The currency became worthless faster than the government could print it. Gold helped. Foreign currency helped more. US dollars became the de facto currency. But even then, what ultimately mattered was access to goods. Farmers with food had power. Traders with supply chain connections had power. People who could provide services, mechanics, doctors, electricians, had power. Gold was a medium of exchange. It allowed you to participate in the exchange, but the goods being exchanged had to exist, and the ability to produce those goods conferred more power than the ability to buy them. This is the mechanism. Gold lets you buy into a functioning exchange. It does not create the exchange. It does not produce the goods being exchanged. Let's now name the constraint. Modern civilization is built on specialization. Each person does one thing well and exchanges for everything else. This is efficient. It produces more total wealth than any alternative, but it creates a single point of failure. The exchange assumption must hold. If it breaks, if supply chains fracture, if logistics fail, if the distribution mechanism collapses, then every specialist becomes helpless. The accountant cannot eat. The software engineer cannot heat his home. The financial analyst cannot grow medicine. We have built a system of extraordinary productive capacity and extraordinary fragility. The constraint is this. You cannot undo specialization quickly. You cannot learn to farm in a week. You cannot build a community of trust during a crisis. You cannot manufacture local production capacity after the supply chains have failed. These things take years, decades, generations. That's the irreversible constraint. If you wait until you need the Amish Hedge, it's too late. And this is where the incentive structure matters. There's a reason you've heard 1,000 times that gold is the ultimate hedge. Gold has a marketing apparatus. Gold dealers need you to buy gold. Gold newsletters need you to fear currency collapse. Gold is a product with high margins and emotional appeal. The Amish Hedge has no marketing apparatus. Nobody makes money telling you to build community. Nobody profits from advising you to learn repair skills. There's no industry behind the recommendation to localize your food supply. So you hear one message thousands of times, and you almost never hear the other. This is not conspiracy, it's incentive structure. The ideas that spread are the ideas that benefit from spreading. Let's be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying you should become Amish. I'm not saying modern technology is bad. I'm not saying gold is worthless. I am saying that the conventional financial preparedness narrative has a blind spot. It addresses monetary failure. It does not address systemic failure. And if you're honest about risk, if you're actually conducting a forensic analysis of what could go wrong, you need to consider both, because history shows that both occur. What does this mean practically? It means that if you're concerned about collapse, whether from currency failure, energy shocks, climate disruption, or institutional breakdown, your preparation should be structured, not merely stockpiled. Consider, do you know the people in your immediate geographic community? Do you have relationships that could function as barter networks? Do you possess skills that would have value if the exchange assumption broke? Consider, is your household entirely dependent on external supply chains for food, energy, medicine? What happens if the trucks stop coming for 30 days? Consider, are you in debt? Because debt is a claim on your future production, and in a crisis, that claim becomes a leash. The Amish prohibition on debt is not moral posturing. It's structural resilience. Consider, can you fix things, build things, grow things? Because in a fractured system, these skills become the true currency. The pattern here is not new. Every complex society in history has faced moments where the exchange assumption failed. The Roman Empire in its final centuries, the late Bronze Age collapse, the fall of the Mayan city-states, the post-plague economy of the 14th century. In each case, wealth stored in monetary form became less valuable than wealth stored in productive capacity. In each case, the people who survived best were not the wealthiest, but the most structurally resilient. In each case, there was no warning that allowed for last-minute adaptation. There's a study, informal but consistent, of what happened to gold holders during the worst collapses. In Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, gold could not protect you. The regime targeted anyone with visible wealth. Hiding gold was possible, using it was not. In war zones, gold is often more dangerous than useful. It attracts violence. It marks you as a target. It cannot be used openly without risk. In grid-down scenarios, localized blackouts, regional disasters, gold is irrelevant. The immediate need is water, food, shelter, medical care. No one is trading gold for water bottles. They're trading skills, labor, and real goods. This is not to say gold has no role. It is to say gold is optimized for one type of failure, monetary failure within a functioning system. It is not optimized for systemic failure. And if you're diversifying your risk, you should diversify your hedges. The question becomes, what else should you hold? And the answer is uncomfortable because it's not a product. Hold skills, hold community, hold productive capacity, hold local relationships, hold land that can produce, hold tools that can build, hold knowledge that can heal. These are not investments. They don't appear on a balance sheet. They can't be liquidated. But they're the assets that survive when the exchange assumption breaks. Let me tell you about a community in rural Pennsylvania, not Amish, but influenced by them. They're modern people. They use technology. They participate in the regular economy. But they've built redundancy. Most households grow some food. Several neighbors have skills in medical care. There are mechanics, welders, carpenters. They know each other. They've organized informal mutual aid agreements. They're not preppers in the bunker sense. They're not hoarding gold or ammunition. They've simply, deliberately, weakened their dependence on the exchange assumption. They've built a partial Amish hedge. It took years. It took effort. It took learning skills that modern life discourages. But if the trucks stop coming, if the grid fails, if the currency collapses, if the supply chains fracture, they will not be standing in a pharmacy with gold coins and nothing to buy. They'll be producing, exchanging, and surviving on the basis of capacity rather than claims. There's a final point worth making. The Amish hedge is not just about collapse, it's about quality of life. Amish communities report higher life satisfaction than average Americans. They have stronger social bonds. They have more meaningful work. They have less anxiety. Building local production capacity, diversified skills, and thick social networks doesn't just protect against systemic failure. It provides something that gold cannot, a different way of living, a way that doesn't depend on the assumption that someone else, somewhere else, will always provide what you need, a way that produces as much as it consumes, a way that doesn't require the exchange assumption to hold at all times. This is historical and educational analysis, not financial or investment advice. Gold is a hedge. It's a good hedge against monetary failure. It is not a complete hedge against systemic failure. And the financial prepper narrative, overwhelmingly funded by people who profit from gold sales, has given you an incomplete picture. The complete picture includes the Amish hedge. It includes skills, community, local production, minimal debt, and the deliberate weakening of dependence on external systems. These cannot be purchased quickly. They cannot be stored in a vault. They must be built over time. And if you wait until you need them, it will already be too late. That's the trap. That's the constraint. That's the pattern. The question isn't whether the exchange assumption will break. History says it always does, eventually, somewhere. The question is whether, when it breaks, you'll be holding a token or holding the capacity to produce. The Amish made their choice generations ago. They've never regretted it. The pattern is already in motion. This channel exists to study the systems before they fail. If this lens was useful, subscribe. Most people never see these patterns until the shelf is empty and the gold is useless.